The year was 1462, and across the rolling hills of Wallachia, smoke rose from burning villages while the earth trembled under the weight of the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled. At its head rode Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, a man whose name alone struck terror into the hearts of Christian Europe. His banners stretched beyond the horizon, a sea of crescents and silk that proclaimed the might of an empire spanning 3 continents. Yet standing in his path was a single man, a prince whose methods were so brutal, so calculating, that even hardened warriors would whisper his name in hushed tones. This was Vlad III of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, and he was about to unleash a campaign of psychological warfare so devastating that it would force the mighty Sultan to retreat in horror. What unfolded in the summer of 1462 was not merely a clash of armies, but a masterclass in terror warfare that would echo through the centuries. A night attack so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it would shatter the morale of the world's most powerful military force. This is the story of how one man's genius for psychological warfare brought an empire to its knees, and why the methods he employed still haunt the pages of military history today. But to understand the sheer audacity of what Vlad accomplished, we must first grasp the overwhelming odds he faced. The Ottoman war machine rolling toward his borders was unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen. Sultan Mehmed himself boasted in letters to his grand viziers that he commanded 150,000 men. The Greek historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who witnessed the spectacle firsthand, described the force as huge, second in size only to the army that had conquered Constantinople itself. Some chroniclers placed the number even higher, at 250,000, perhaps even 300,000 souls marching under the crescent banner. This was not merely an army, it was an empire in motion. At its core stood the dreaded Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers whose discipline and ferocity had conquered kingdoms. Around them marched regiments of infantry, while the thunder of hooves announced the approach of the Sipahis, the feudal cavalry whose charges had broken Christian lines from Hungary to the gates of Vienna. Behind them came the Siales, sacrificial units of slaves who could win their freedom through valor in battle, their desperation making them perhaps the most dangerous fighters of all. The diversity of this host was staggering. Akinji archers drew their bows alongside Siladars who guarded the Sultan's flanks. Azabs wielded their pikes, while Beshlis handled the new firearms that were changing the face of warfare. And at the center of it all rode Mehmed's personal bodyguards, warriors whose sole purpose was to protect the man who had humbled Byzantium itself. But numbers were only part of the terror. The Ottomans brought with them 120 cannon, their bronze mouths ready to reduce castle walls to rubble. Engineers and workers followed in their wake, ready to build roads and bridges that would carry this avalanche of steel deeper into Christian lands. Even the spiritual needs of the army were met, with Islamic priests and muezzins calling the faithful to prayer, while astrologers consulted the stars to guide the Sultan's decisions. The logistics alone were staggering. Chalkokondyles recorded that Danube shipowners were paid 300,000 gold pieces simply to transport this army across the river. Women accompanied the force, reserved for the night pleasures of the men, while supply trains stretched for miles, carrying everything needed to sustain this moving city of war. Against this overwhelming tide stood Vlad with perhaps 30,000 men at most. The disparity was crushing, 5-1 in favor of the Ottomans, possibly more. Any conventional military commander would have sued for peace, accepted vassalage, or fled to the mountains to await a more favorable time. But Vlad the Impaler was no conventional commander. He had learned his lessons in the courts of his enemies, and what he had learned would now be turned against them with devastating effect. The roots of this confrontation stretched back years, to a time when the young Vlad had been held as a hostage at the Ottoman court, alongside his brother Radu. While Radu had thrived in captivity, converting to Islam and rising through the ranks to command Ottoman troops, Vlad had nursed a hatred that bordered on madness. He had studied his captors with the intensity of a scholar, learning their language, their customs, their weaknesses, and when the time came to use that knowledge, he would wield it like a blade. The immediate cause of the war was Vlad's refusal to pay the traditional tribute demanded by the Sultan. 10,000 ducats and 500 recruits were the price of peace, but Vlad's answer was written in blood and iron. When Ottoman envoys arrived to collect the tribute, they found their turbans nailed to their heads, a message that even the most diplomatic mind could not misinterpret. The die was cast. But Vlad did not wait for the Sultan's response. In a move that stunned even his own followers, he launched a preemptive strike across the Danube into Ottoman Bulgaria. What followed was a campaign of such calculated brutality that it defied comprehension. Village after village fell to his raiders, and in each one, Vlad left his signature calling card. Stakes rose from the earth like a forest of death, bearing the impaled bodies of Ottoman subjects. In a letter to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Vlad catalogued his work with chilling precision: 23,884 Turks, not counting those burned in their homes or beheaded by his soldiers. The numbers rolled off his pen like items in a merchant's ledger, each one representing a calculated act of terror designed to send a message that would reach the Sultan's ears. This was not mere warfare. It was a declaration that a new kind of enemy had emerged, one who understood that in the game of empires, fear could be more powerful than steel. Mehmed's response was swift and terrible. Messengers rode in all directions, summoning an army that would dwarf even the force that had taken Constantinople. The Sultan himself would lead this expedition, and when it was done, Wallachia would be nothing more than another Ottoman province, and Vlad's head would adorn the gates of Adrianople. As the great host assembled and began its march toward the Danube, few could have imagined what awaited them in the hills and forests of Wallachia. The prince who had once been their captive had spent his years of freedom preparing for this moment. He had studied not just the art of war, but the science of terror, and he was about to give the world a lesson in both that would be remembered for centuries. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit the largest army in the world against one man's genius for psychological warfare. In the darkness of a June night, with torches flickering and horses snorting in anticipation, Vlad the Impaler would prove that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not the sword, but the mind that wields it. The Ottoman juggernaut crossed the Danube like a plague of locusts, their ships darkening the waters while their banners blotted out the Sunday. But as Mehmed's vast army pushed deeper into Wallachian territory, they found something far worse than an enemy army waiting for them. They found nothing at all. Vlad had anticipated this moment for months, perhaps years. While other princes might have gathered their forces for a glorious last stand, the Impaler chose a different path entirely. As the Ottoman vanguard advanced, they discovered village after village standing empty, their inhabitants vanished like smoke. Wells had been poisoned with the bloated corpses of animals, their waters turned black and foul. Granaries stood bare, their contents scattered to the wind or consumed by flames that had died days before the invaders arrived. This was scorched earth warfare elevated to an art form. Vlad had evacuated entire populations to the mountains, driving livestock and supplies beyond Ottoman reach, while leaving behind a wasteland that could sustain nothing larger than a scouting party. Rivers were diverted to create treacherous marshes where once solid ground had stood. Roads were torn up and replaced with carefully concealed pits, their timber coverings disguised with leaves and brush, waiting to snap the legs of horses and men alike. The psychological effect on the advancing Ottomans was immediate and devastating. Turkish chronicler Tursun Beg would later write of how the front ranks reported that there was not a drop of water to quench their thirst. The heat of the sun was so merciless that soldiers joked they could cook kebabs on their mail shirts, but the laughter died quickly as reality set in. This was not the easy conquest they had expected. They were marching through a land that seemed cursed, where every step forward brought them deeper into a nightmare designed by a madman. For 7 days, Mehmed's army pushed forward, finding no man, no animal, nothing to eat or drink. The Sultan, who had conquered the greatest city in the world, now found himself the commander of a force slowly starving in hostile territory. His soldiers, accustomed to the rich plunder that followed Ottoman victories, instead faced empty villages and poisoned wells. Morale began to crack like ice under spring Sunday, but Vlad was far from finished. As the Ottomans struggled through his wasteland, Wallachian cavalry struck like lightning from the surrounding hills and forests. These were not pitched battles, but lightning raids designed to terrorize and demoralize. Horsemen would appear without warning, strike at supply trains or isolated units, then vanish back into the wilderness before the Ottomans could respond. Sleep became a luxury, as sentries jumped at every shadow, every sound in the darkness beyond their campfires. The Prince of Wallachia had learned well from his years of captivity. He understood that the Ottoman military machine, for all its power, depended on momentum and supply. Strip away both, replace them with fear and uncertainty, and even the mightiest army could be brought low. Each attack was precisely calculated, not for the casualties it inflicted, but for the terror it spread. Ottoman soldiers began to whisper among themselves, wondering what manner of demon they faced in these accursed lands. Yet even this campaign of harassment and attrition was merely preparation for Vlad's masterpiece. As the Ottoman army struggled toward Târgoviște, the capital of Wallachia, their commander was planning something that would demonstrate the true depths of his tactical genius. What he needed was intelligence, detailed knowledge of the enemy camp that could only be obtained through the most dangerous of methods. On the night of June 16th, as Ottoman sentries peered nervously into the darkness beyond their fires, a lone figure approached their camp. He wore Turkish dress and spoke perfect Ottoman Turkish, his accent bearing no trace of the Wallachian mountains. To the guards at the camp's perimeter, he appeared to be nothing more than a late messenger or perhaps a local guide seeking to curry favor with the conquerors. This figure was Vlad himself, disguised and walking calmly into the heart of enemy territory. The audacity of such an act defies comprehension. Here was a man with a price on his head, whose very name was synonymous with terror throughout the Ottoman Empire, strolling through a military camp containing over 100,000 soldiers who would have torn him apart with their bare hands had they recognized him. But Vlad's disguise was perfect, honed by years of observation and practice. He had spent his formative years among these people, learning not just their language but their mannerisms, their customs, their military protocols. Now he used that knowledge to walk freely among his enemies, his eyes taking in every detail of their disposition. He noted the location of the Sultan's great pavilion, marked by its distinctive standards and the elite guards who surrounded it. He observed the placement of the Janissary units, the positioning of the cavalry, the locations where officers gathered for their evening councils. Every detail was burned into his memory, every weakness catalogued for future exploitation. The Ottoman commanders, confident in their overwhelming superiority, had grown careless with their security. That carelessness would soon cost them dearly. As he moved through the camp, Vlad also gathered crucial intelligence about Ottoman morale and discipline. He heard the grumbling of soldiers exhausted by their march through his wasteland, the complaints of officers frustrated by the lack of easy victories. Most importantly, he learned from casual conversations that Mehmed had issued strict orders forbidding his men from leaving their tents during the night hours, a precaution designed to prevent panic in case of attack. This single piece of information was worth more than gold. Vlad now knew that when his assault came, the very measures designed to protect the Ottoman army would instead trap his enemies in their canvas prisons. The soldiers would be confined to their tents, unable to organize effective resistance, while confusion and terror did his work for him. Having gathered all the intelligence he needed, Vlad slipped away from the Ottoman camp as easily as he had entered it. No alarm was raised, no pursuit followed. To the guards who had seen him pass, he was just another face in the crowd, another servant of the Sultan going about his business in the night. They had no idea they had just encountered the most dangerous man in the Balkans, or that their fate had been sealed by his midnight reconnaissance. Back in the hills surrounding the Ottoman position, Vlad gathered his most trusted commanders and began to outline his plan. What he proposed was so bold, so seemingly impossible, that lesser men might have questioned his sanity. But these were veterans who had followed him through years of brutal warfare, men who had seen him achieve the impossible before. When their prince spoke of riding directly into the enemy camp under cover of darkness, they did not hesitate to follow. The preparations for the night attack began immediately, with Vlad selecting his most elite cavalry for the mission ahead. These were not ordinary soldiers, but hand-picked warriors who had proven themselves in countless skirmishes against Ottoman forces. 7,000 to 10,000 horsemen, each one a veteran of the brutal frontier warfare that had raged across the Danube for years. They were men who could ride in complete silence, who could strike with devastating precision, and who would follow their prince into the gates of hell itself if he commanded it. As the sun set on June 16th, these chosen warriors made their final preparations. Swords were sharpened to razor edges, horses were fed and watered, and each man checked his equipment with the methodical care of someone who knew his life depended on every buckle and strap. There would be no second chances once they entered the Ottoman camp. No opportunity to correct mistakes or retrieve forgotten items. Every detail had to be perfect. Vlad himself moved among his men, offering final instructions and words of encouragement. His presence was electric, radiating the confidence of a commander who had never known defeat. To his soldiers, he was more than a prince. He was a force of nature, a man who had stared into the abyss of Ottoman power and refused to blink. When he spoke of riding into the enemy camp, it was not with bravado, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already seen the outcome in his mind. The plan was elegantly simple in its audacity. Using the intelligence he had gathered during his reconnaissance, Vlad would lead his cavalry directly to the main gate of the Ottoman camp. There, speaking perfect Turkish and relying on the darkness to conceal his identity, he would order the guards to open the gates. Once inside, his men would spread chaos throughout the camp, while he and his personal guard drove straight for the Sultan's pavilion. The timing had to be precise. Too early and the camp would still be alert. Too late and dawn would expose them before they could complete their mission. Vlad chose the darkest hour before dawn, when human alertness naturally reaches its lowest ebb and shadows could hide an army of horsemen. The moon was new, offering no light to betray their approach, while the Ottoman sentries would be fighting the natural drowsiness that comes with the long watches of the night. As midnight approached, the Wallachian cavalry moved out in absolute silence. Horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound. Metal equipment was secured to prevent any telltale rattling, and orders were passed by hand signals rather than whispered words. They descended from the hills like phantoms, their dark forms barely visible against the star-filled sky. The Ottoman camp sprawled before them like a small city, its countless tents arranged in precise military order. Campfires dotted the landscape like fallen stars, their light creating pools of illumination separated by deep pools of shadow. The scale was overwhelming, a testament to the might of the empire that had created it. Yet somewhere in that vast maze of canvas and rope lay their target, and Vlad guided his men toward it with the confidence of someone who had walked those paths before. At the main gate, the moment of ultimate audacity arrived. Vlad rode forward alone, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air as he called out in perfect Turkish. The guards, half asleep and expecting nothing more threatening than a late messenger, responded exactly as he had anticipated. The gate swung open, and in that instant, the fate of the Ottoman army was sealed. The Wallachian cavalry poured through the opening like a black tide, their silence finally broken as they spread throughout the camp. Suddenly, the night erupted in chaos as torches blazed to life, illuminating scenes of utter pandemonium. Horses reared and screamed as Wallachian riders cut through tent ropes and scattered supply wagons. Camels bolted in terror, trampling everything in their path, while their Ottoman handlers struggled to maintain control. The effect was multiplied by the very precautions Mehmed had put in place to prevent such an attack. Ottoman soldiers, forbidden from leaving their tents during night hours, found themselves trapped in canvas prisons as Wallachian cavalry thundered past. Those who did emerge found themselves disoriented in the darkness, unable to distinguish friend from foe, often striking down their own comrades in the confusion. Vlad himself rode at the head of his personal guard, cutting a path of destruction toward the Sultan's pavilion. His sword flashed in the torchlight as he carved through anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. Behind him, his men followed like avenging angels, their battle cries echoing across the camp as they spread terror in their wake. For these brief moments, they were not the outnumbered defenders of a small principality, but the masters of the battlefield, their audacity transforming them into something approaching the mythical. The Ottoman response was everything Vlad could have hoped for. Confusion reigned supreme as units attacked each other in the darkness, convinced they were fighting Wallachian infiltrators. The careful organization that was the hallmark of Ottoman military efficiency collapsed into chaos as officers struggled to determine what was happening and how to respond. The sound of battle seemed to come from every direction at once, creating the impression that the camp was under assault by a force far larger than the relatively small number of Wallachian cavalry actually involved. For 3 hours, the nightmare continued. From midnight until the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, Wallachian horsemen struck again and again at different points throughout the camp, their mobility allowing them to appear and disappear like ghosts. Supply trains were scattered, horses were stampeded, and the careful order of the Ottoman war machine was reduced to smoking ruins. Yet for all the chaos they had created, Vlad and his men had failed in their primary objective. When they finally reached the Sultan's great pavilion, they found it empty. Mehmed, either through luck or the quick thinking of his bodyguards, had been spirited away to safety before the Wallachian cavalry could reach him. The golden opportunity to end the war with a single stroke had slipped through their fingers like smoke. As dawn broke over the devastated Ottoman camp, Vlad made the hardest decision a commander can face. The mission had achieved everything except its most crucial goal, and to remain longer would risk the destruction of his entire force. With characteristic pragmatism, he ordered the withdrawal. The Wallachian cavalry melted away into the morning mist as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would haunt Ottoman nightmares for years to come. The immediate aftermath of the attack was almost as devastating as the assault itself. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead, though historians would debate for centuries whether they had fallen to Wallachian blades or to their own comrades in the confusion. Horses and camels wandered aimlessly through the wreckage of what had once been an orderly military camp. Supply wagons lay overturned and burning, their contents scattered across the blood-soaked earth. But the true damage went far deeper than mere casualty figures could measure. The psychological impact of the night attack rippled through the Ottoman ranks like a plague, infecting even those who had not been present to witness it firsthand. These were men accustomed to victory, soldiers of an empire that had conquered half the known world. To see their great army brought low by what seemed like a handful of Wallachian horsemen challenged everything they believed about their own invincibility. Mehmed himself was shaken by how close death had come to finding him in his own camp. The Sultan who had breached the walls of Constantinople, who had never known defeat in battle, had been forced to flee like a common soldier before an enemy he had dismissed as a minor irritant. The blow to his prestige was immense, and word of the attack would spread throughout his empire, planting seeds of doubt in minds that had never questioned Ottoman supremacy. Yet even as the Ottomans struggled to restore order to their devastated camp, Vlad was already preparing his next move. The night attack had been spectacular, but it was merely the opening act in a campaign of psychological warfare that would push the limits of human endurance and redefine the very concept of terror in medieval combat. The aftermath that followed would cement Vlad's reputation as history's master of psychological warfare. When Mehmed's army finally limped into Târgoviște weeks later, they encountered a sight that would break even the Sultan's iron will. 20,000 stakes rose from the earth like a forest of death, each bearing the rotting corpse of an Ottoman prisoner. At the highest stake, positioned for maximum impact, hung the body of Hamza Pasha, a high-ranking Ottoman commander whose elevated position symbolized his former rank in the most macabre way imaginable. The Greek chronicler Chalco-Condyles recorded that the Sultan himself was seized with amazement, declaring that it was impossible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds. Even Mehmed the Conqueror, who had witnessed the horrors of a dozen battlefields, was forced to acknowledge the diabolical genius of his opponent. The psychological warfare had achieved what conventional armies could not. It had broken the will of the world's most powerful empire. Within days, the Ottoman army began its retreat. The force that had crossed the Danube with dreams of conquest now fled back across its waters, their morale shattered and their confidence in ruins. The night attack at Târgoviște had lasted mere hours, but its effects would echo through history. Vlad the Impaler had proven that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with superior numbers or better weapons, but with the courage to embrace tactics so audacious that they redefine the very nature of warfare itself. His legacy endures as a testament to the power of the human mind when pushed to its absolute limits, and a reminder that in the darkest hours, the most unlikely heroes can emerge to change the course of history. The night attack at Târgoviște stands as one of history's most audacious military gambles, a masterpiece of psychological warfare that transformed a desperate last stand into a legendary victory. In the space of 3 dark hours, Vlad the Impaler demonstrated that tactical brilliance and sheer audacity could overcome seemingly impossible odds. His 7,000 cavalry had not merely defeated an army of 150,000 men, they had shattered the very foundations of Ottoman confidence and forced the conqueror of Constantinople to retreat in terror. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is how Vlad turned his greatest weakness into his most powerful weapon. Vastly outnumbered and facing certain destruction through conventional warfare, he instead chose to wage war on the human mind itself. Every element of his campaign, from the scorched-earth tactics to the forest of stakes at Târgoviște, was designed not simply to kill enemies, but to break their will to fight. In doing so, he created a template for asymmetric warfare that military strategists still study today. The Sultan, who had humbled Byzantium, returned to his capital with his reputation in ruins and his army's morale shattered. Mehmed II had learned a lesson that would echo through the corridors of power for generations, that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the largest army, but the one willing to embrace methods so brutal and brilliant that they transcend the boundaries of conventional warfare. Vlad's legacy endures not merely as a tale of medieval brutality, but as proof that in the darkest moments of history, when all seems lost, human ingenuity and unshakable will can achieve the impossible. The Prince of Wallachia had saved his homeland and secured his place in legend, reminding us that sometimes the greatest victories belong not to the strongest, but to those brave enough to rewrite the rules of war itself.